2011 Hirshhorn Museum Sculpture Garden's Summer Camp Film Festival. As Jessica said, my name is Dave Wilt, and I'll be here each Thursday night for the next 3 weeks introducing the films, giving you some background, and using anecdotes, historical highlights, fascinating facts, and generally, hopefully entertaining, enlightening, edifying, educating, perhaps, about the films and the period in which they were made. Long, long ago, in 2006 to be precise, the Hirshhorn programming staff, led by Kelly Gordon, who, as Jessica said, is on injured reserve right now, but we hope we'll have her back at least by the 3rd week of the summer camp this year. Since then, they've endeavored to brighten your otherwise drab and dreary existence by, at least summertime, by having the Summer Camp Film Festival. And despite their best efforts to keep me from finding out when it is, I've been here every year as your chief cinematic camp counselor. This year's theme is Sauceriferous, and no, I can't really explain what it means. I suggested some possible alternate names like Delightfully Saucery, Area 51, Where Are You? And in a blatantly misleading attempt to bring in larger crowds, the alien Harry Potter versus the Twilight aliens. But they decided that it would be Sauceriferous, not saucerific, not saucerlicious, but Sauceriferous. This year we're showing 3 alien invasion movies from the 1950s. Tonight's feature is the original, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Next week it's the original, The War of the Worlds. And the week after that is the original, and in fact the only, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. For some reason they didn't remake that one yet. All of these movies have a lot in common. They each feature a different view of flying saucers and aliens. Tonight's film has a good alien. War of the Worlds has bad aliens, and Earth versus the Flying Saucers features sort of misunderstood aliens. The films we're going to see are pure entertainment. They were accepted as much when they were made in the 1950s, but the concept of flying saucers meant a lot more to people in that era. Flying saucers were a big thing back then. Most of us today, when we watch a vampire movie or a zombie movie or Harry Potter or something like that, we assume there's no such thing as vampires or zombies or wizards. Now, of course, films themselves are fictional stories, but that's obvious. But even on a very basic level, we don't believe in the existence of the creatures that those films were made about. But things were different in the 50s. While nobody thought The Day the Earth Stood Still, or War of the Worlds, or Earth versus the Flying Saucers were documentaries, the actual existence of flying saucers, or UFOs, or whatever, was hotly debated at the time. So there was a feeling that there could be some underlying truth in these movies. I mean, if we know there's no such things as vampires, it doesn't really matter whether there's good vampires or bad vampires, because they don't exist. But if flying saucers could exist, then that leaves open many possible outcomes. Unidentified flying objects had apparently been around for quite some time, back to the biblical period. And science fiction literature and films have used alien invasions as plot devices since the late 19th century. You see War of the Worlds, based on a novel by H.G. Wells, written right around the turn of the century. But the modern day concept of flying saucers really dates only to 1947. In June of that year, a private pilot flying in Washington State observed a group of shiny objects in the sky, and he reported it to the authorities and to the media. Now, he didn't use the precise term flying saucers, he just said they were disc-shaped. But the term flying saucers was coined, and the media picked it up, and it became a very hot topic in a very short period of time. Other sightings followed and were given more publicity thanks to this sudden interest in the clever term flying saucers. And soon, comic books and toys and other artifacts of popular culture were focused on these mysterious flying saucers. Movies also pounced on the subject, although initially flying saucers were fodder for mostly low-budget productions. Why did the concept of flying saucers seize the public's imagination so quickly in such a powerful manner in the late 1940s and early 1950s? It wasn't a case of a publicity campaign for a particular movie. Movies about flying saucers and aliens were made in response to the public's interest in flying saucers, rather than today's viral marketing where they draw up some sort of story about something that it turns out to be just promotion for a movie. And nor was the excitement about flying saucers caused by a single event that everybody immediately recognized as historic and important. So there's no clear answer why they suddenly became very popular and very in the public eye. But in 1947, America and the rest of the world were poised between the end of the Second World War and whatever the future might bring for good or ill. During the war, enormous scientific and technical strides had been made. Germany had the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, and then of course there was the atomic bomb. And then suddenly, the modern world that the people had lived in the 1930s seemed impossibly outmoded in just a few years. Now suddenly there were jet airplanes flying in the sky, and people began watching television instead of listening to the radio. So things were very, very different in a very short period of time. In this period, flying saucers were initially not automatically assumed to be of extraterrestrial origin. As I just said, everybody was well aware of this new technology that had come about because of the war, and given the geopolitical climate of the period, people were thinking, the United States were thinking, well, maybe the Russians have developed some new secret weapons, flying saucers, or maybe on a more positive thought, maybe it's one of our new secret weapons that the government doesn't want to know about, and that's what flying saucers are. However, pretty quickly, that sort of faded into the background, and people discounted that in favor of the alien invaders theory, because that was just so much cooler. The widespread interest in flying saucers in the United States and really across the world continued through the 1950s. Some people became really fanatic about it, others were skeptical, others investigated in a more or less scientific manner. But the topic wasn't dismissed by the general public as a passing fad, and a significant percentage of the population was at least aware of and probably had an open mind about the existence of UFOs. The furor died down as the 50s grew closed, but then in the 1960s it picked up again with a new wave of UFO sightings, and which inspired a new batch of movies, comic books, TV series, toys, and so forth. Now today, only probably a relatively small number of people think about UFOs in real life on a regular basis. You can go on the internet and find all sorts of web pages about it, but really it's not something that shows up on the front page of the newspaper all the time. Really, most of us only give flying saucers or UFOs a fleeting thought when there's news reports of mysterious objects in the sky over Phoenix, Arizona, or something like that, or when something like alien autopsy shows up on television and you think about it for a minute and it goes out of your mind. So it's rather difficult for us to understand today the grip that the concept of flying saucers had on the imagination of the American public and during the 1950s. Both the day the Earth stood still and Earth versus the flying saucers should be of particular interest to us because most of these films' action unfolds right here in Washington, D.C. Pure sensationalistic movie claptrap is au contraire, my skeptical friends. The Day the Earth Stood Still was released in September 1951. One of the iconic images in the movie was this photo showing the flying saucer on the Mall, surrounded by troops and a large crowd of onlookers. Now this didn't really happen, but less than a year later, it looked like it actually might. Washington, D.C. was the site of one of the most notorious flying saucer events of the 1950s, although admittedly it was more sensational because it occurred in the nation's capital rather than because of how amazing or unique it was. In the early part of the flying saucer era, UFOs were seen in many parts of the United States and the world, but for some reason, many, although not all of the sightings, were in rural areas or out in the desert, small towns, and so forth. But in July 1952, on 2 consecutive Saturday nights, air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base observed unexplained objects on their radar screens, with some pilots and ground observers also spotting brightly lit shapes in the sky. In a weird coincidence, or was it, the Day the Earth Stood Still was set in July 1951. Jets were actually scrambled, but UFOs vanished, returning when the jets departed. And this happened 2 consecutive weeks. This audacious flying saucer raid on Washington, D.C. made international headlines, especially when rumors came out that the intercepting jets had orders to shoot down the flying saucers if necessary. Although the Air Force attempted to explain away the multiple incidents as a result of meteorological phenomenon, the district's encounter with flying saucers remained one of the most famous events of the original flying saucer era, and is still periodically the subject of documentaries and news stories whenever the anniversary rolls around or whenever there's a slow news day. As I said before, the earliest films to cash in on the flying saucer fad were low-budget efforts. However, the real-life sightings increased and became more credible and less likely to be the result of some random crackpots or mistaken identity. So major media attention was directed towards the topic. Both Life and Look magazines, which were mainstream popular magazines, ran serious stories on flying saucers, admitting the possibility of extraterrestrial origin, and larger Hollywood studios and respected filmmakers also took note.